So you want to start or continue winning in MMA. Well, I'm going to run through what the most winningest, if that's even a word, MMA fighters do and the qualities they possess to be able to continue winning at the highest level. This is all backed by research and science, and I'm going to break it down for you so you can apply it within your own training programs. And before I get into that, always check the description, guys. I have free boxing, MMA, and jiu-jitsu strength conditioning blueprints that just run you through everything you need to know for your own strength conditioning, or you can just work with me one-on-one. There's a link down there, or you can join my training app that has all my training programs. You don't even have to think for yourself. It is all there. Has a year's plus worth of programming for either strikers, grapplers, or MMA fighters. So make sure you check those out. So I'm going to come into my notes. We're going to go through the very first paper that I have here. It is by Lachlan James and his colleagues. Lachlan James has some great research if you want to look him up in Google Scholar. But in 2016, they compared 15 semi-pro MMA fighters to 14 amateurs. And this is what they found. The semi-professional MMA fighters had greater back squat 1RM relative to body weight. So they were able to squat 1.84 times body weight versus 1.56 on average. They had greater relative impulse during loaded and unloaded jumps, which likely means they were able to jump higher in this instance. Greater impulse at 300 milliseconds during loaded and unloaded jumps. Because time is capped and impulse is force multiplied by time, it means they're able to produce more force in that short time frame. They had greater peak power, velocity, and force for each jump. They had greater peak rate of power development, even though they had similar 1RM relative bench press and isometric mid-thigh pulls between groups. So in this particular cohort, upper body pushing strength and maximal symmetric strength of the whole body did not differentiate between these groups, but the more speed-based variables did, and of course the back squat 1RM. It shows that MMA requires high force action, and being able to produce high forces at varying speeds seems to underpin MMA sporting actions. Remember, if higher level athletes in a sport have certain qualities that lower level athletes don't, it is likely that those qualities are important for success in that sport. So if we go to 2020, Lachlan James and his colleagues, again, using the same subjects, I believe, analyzed jump performance even further. And what they found was higher level MMA fighters jumped higher and generated greater force, velocity, and power. But more importantly, they also had shorter eccentric phases, meaning faster eccentric loading, and are able to produce more force faster than low-level MMA athletes. And what I find very interesting about that last statement on shorter eccentric phases is Bill Smart's internal testing data, which he just analyzed this year with his UFC guys, and we're talking mainly top 5 guys, champions, legends in the sport, supports this statement, where he saw UFC fighters compared to non-UFC fighters had greater eccentric peak velocity, eccentric deceleration impulse relative to body mass, and force at zero velocity relative to body mass, meaning they were able to descend faster in the jump, they were able to pump the brakes faster, and then they were able to reverse that eccentric phase faster. And why is that even important? Sport is constrained by time. If you're having to go lower in the jump to be able to produce the impulse to come back up, you're taking more time, and it suggests that you'll have to do the same thing within the sport of MMA to be able to, say, throw your strikes quickly. You're gonna have to wind up more or spend more time to be able to deliver that impulse into the target. If you go and watch my How to Punch Harder video after this, that goes into detail on that. But if I was to sum up all this data into one thing, you must be capable of producing high force actions quickly, which is underpinned by eccentric and elastic qualities. And I'm gonna touch on what this means for your training soon. But I also want to touch on the fact that physical qualities alone don't win your fights, and I think you already know that. So I want to go through this study, and there hasn't been an updated one, I don't believe. If there has been, please let me know and send it to me. But Miyake and colleagues in 2014 analyzed 351 UFC fights to determine what technical components influence a winning performance. They found winners were able to increase activity from round to round, whereas losers decreased activity. They found winners spent the first round reacting to an opponent and filling them out, and then transitioned into an anticipatory mode where they are better able to read their opponent. I think what commentators are always saying about Floyd Mayweather as an example, where he's downloading information before he kicks into gear, that would be a very simple example to give. You could even use within MMA Israel Adesanya, where his first rounds are typically slower as he's reading his opponent, throwing calf kicks, etc. In contrast, losers reduce their key actions after the first round. Now, this is likely isn't only a physical attribute problem, but it definitely does play a role. Winners are able to better anticipate their opponent's attacks And on the ground, winners had greater submission attempts, advances to half guard, side control, back, and mount position than losers, which kind of makes sense since the better grapplers are likely to be able to do all these things and win in these situations. Now, bear in mind that this data is from the early 2010s. So MMA has evolved dramatically since then. I mean, we see grappling now was so heavily wrestling dominated that being on top is the preferred place to be no matter what. Whereas if you're going back in the day, you had strong jiu-jitsu practitioners that would also play off their back. You have the calf kicks now that have become a common weapon and really changed MMA stand-up. But I would argue many of these findings probably still remain true today. And so what does this mean for your training? If we start from the technical aspects, it's about seeing as many situations as possible in training. Now, you may not have much control over this depending on where you are doing your MMA technical training, but there are some things that you can do. The biggest one is live training with different training partners, especially unknown training partners, because you want to see as many different rhythms, styles, and tempos as possible. When you're training against the same guys at your local gym, which I'm sure you've all felt and been familiar with, you know each other's game, you trust each other within that you're not going to injure each other. So even when you're going live and you're going hard, you understand what positions they're already going to go to, what submissions or what movements they're going to make based on what you're going to do. And therefore the game becomes slightly less intense and you know where you can both rest. If you're doing live training against someone you don't know, while you may somewhat trust them, you still don't know what they're going to do in certain positions. You're not used to that style, you're not used to that rhythm, you're not used to that tempo, and these are the things you're going to have to solve when you're within your competitive MMA fight. So having more training partners, or at least going to other gyms, or whatever it is, just being able to do live training against other people that you're not used to fighting is perfect. And you want to make sure there's a mix. You want guys that are mainly strikers, mainly grapplers, taller guys, shorter guys, guys that like to counterattack, guys that like to put pressure on. You need to be able to be exposed to as much of this as possible because you need to problem solve on the fly to be able to figure out that problem. Once you start figuring out how to deal with the pressure of this person, maybe the pressure from another fighter is different because maybe he's shooting for takedowns where the other guy's pressure is mainly striking based. And you're going to have to be able to figure out the puzzle of both of these. And then within the live sparring itself, you may be looking to do different positional work. You may be looking to make a smaller octagon, a larger octagon. You may be looking to only go off the fence. Maybe it's different tempos within that live training, or maybe you're only allowed to use certain techniques. These are all things that can be manipulated in order to hyper focus on certain situations and give you a broader spectrum of problems to solve within your training that you can then translate into MMA performance in the cage. And this is the same for all sports. So instead of just doing plain MMA sparring every time, there are ways that you can manipulate that sparring to be able to get more out of it. So if we move to our strength and power training, it's pretty simple. You're gonna have a mix of your heavy maximal strength training with your ballistic movements. Now, periods of eccentric overload, whether that's fast or slow, is probably important in here since the eccentric qualities seem to differentiate between high and lower level MMA guys, at least who have mainly striking backgrounds. If you tested, say, the Dagestani MMA team, potentially that may not be there because a lot of them do have strong wrestling and grappling backgrounds. I don't know. But typically, at least having this quality is still important because it's going to allow you to be able to shorten that time to be able to produce that impulse or force. And therefore, you're able to transfer more momentum in that short time frame. So you're looking to target the structural adaptations of things like muscle fascicle length and tendon stiffness. Tendon stiffness comes from high strain movements, so your maximal strength training will do that. Your muscle fascicle length adaptations, which is just increasing the length of those muscle fibers, increase the contractile velocity the longer it is. You're going to do things like your eccentric overloads, like I mentioned, your long duration isometrics at long muscle lengths. Even just full range of motion strength training can help. These are some of your main priorities within your training. Now, if you have more fancy equipment, you have some money, flywheels are great for this too. You're also looking at neural adaptations. So you're looking at things like rate coding or firing frequency. That comes mainly from ballistic action. So the more explosive movements you're doing, the more frequently you can fire those neural signals to the muscle to contract faster. And then you have motor unit recruitment that just comes from heavy strength training and your ballistic movements as well. And that's just going to increase your capacity to produce force. To a certain extent, the maximal strength numbers don't matter, since as the time to produce force decreases, the shared variance between maximal isometric force, which is essentially a measure of your peak force production, and rate of force development becomes weaker, meaning the numbers you put up on a maximal strength test contribute less to the force being produced at faster timeframes. In other words, there's only so much time to produce force at these short timeframes that you need to actually train this ability specifically. And again, this comes down to the adaptations that I mentioned before and having a heavy ballistic plyometric emphasis within your training program. And then we have the conditioning element. You need the ability to work with 5-minute rounds, but you need also the ability to recover between high intensity efforts and obviously recover between the rounds. And then you have practice itself, where you need to be fit enough to be able to train and practice multiple times a week and sometimes multiple times a day. So if we're looking specifically within MMA, one of the things that you probably need to start doing, at least within your live training, which kind of falls under technical, is to train those transitions. So the transitions from striking to the fence, to the ground, standing back up. These are things that typically drain everyone who's doing the sport. Having to sprawl, wrestle, get up and strike again and do that over and over is taxing. So these things can be trained within the live training. But to support that, you need some of the physiology. Now you're gonna get some of the physiology from the live training, but you're gonna miss targeting some of these specific adaptations because you aren't able to hit their very, very high intensities. So in this instance, you want to try and target the peripheral adaptations, which would be mitochondrial function and creating new mitochondria to be able to use oxygen effectively and also refuel oxygen after efforts. And this comes down to high intensity or maximal intensity sprint intervals. This can be done specifically on a heavy bag or can be done on a bike like an air bike. You've also got longer duration, high intensity intervals, things like running up a hill for 2 to 5 minutes and then taking 1 to 3 minutes of rest. And these all together are going to start developing that aerobic engine through improving your fatigue resistance at the muscular level. And this is often missed when people are talking about conditioning within combat sports like MMA, because they're so focused on low intensity steady state cardio and improving oxygen delivery, when oxygen delivery likely isn't the limiting factor. So you combine all these things together into your training program, and that's when you start getting winning fighter performances. And if you want to go deeper into MMA strength training, I highly recommend you watch this video next because it actually runs through everything you need to know for strength training for MMA.